Friends, I have some very upsetting news to report. International superstar Shakira was recently the victim of a horrific crime, and despite being surrounded by bystanders, no one helped her. Here's the video where Shakira describes what happened. This was originally posted to her Instagram Live, but she's speaking Spanish, so I will explain. While she was in a Barcelona park with her son eating ice cream, 30 to 50 wild hogs, 2 wild boars rushed her, stole her purse, dug through it, and then stole a sandwich that was inside before running off into the woods. Speaking on the incident later, she says, "I was like, oh my God, and screaming because they were taking it away with my phone in it, my car keys, everything. Like they could understand me. And people were just watching and they weren't doing anything." Boom. Allow me to introduce you to a little concept known as the bystander effect. The idea that a bunch of people who witness something terrible happening are less likely to do anything about it because everyone will assume that someone else in the crowd will do the thing that's needed to be done. The horror of humanity. I almost didn't make this video because I assume at this point everyone already knows that the bystander effect has largely been discredited. That's right. I was just fucking with you. No one helped Shakira in her time of need, not because of the bystander effect, but because boars are very large and terrifying, and Shakira is a rich lady who can afford to buy another sandwich. I mean, yes, 43% of Americans do think that they could beat a boar in a hand-to-hoof fight, but we just don't know the numbers for Spaniards. So, also, that's just a lot to process. If you're just out on your lunch break in the local park, like, oh, look, it's international multimillionaire pop star Shakira. Oh, and here are 200-pound wild animals mugging her of her sandwich. And it's over before it even started. The idea of the bystander effect largely stems from the now famous Kitty Genovese case. In 1964, 28-year-old Genovese was stabbed to death in front of her apartment building in Queens, New York, at around 3 a.m. 2 weeks later, the New York Times reported that 38 people witnessed the murder, but none of them called the police or came to her aid. Now, that was obviously wrong from the outset. 38 people were not just hanging out in front of a Queens apartment at 3 a.m, just watching a woman be murdered. But despite that, and despite competing newspapers at the time that found inaccuracies in the New York Times reporting, this kicked off several decades of psychologists insisting that this was clearly the bystander effect in action. In fact, several neighbors heard the attack and called the police. One neighbor shouted at the attacker to leave her alone, and the calls to police eventually led to an ambulance finding her and rushing her to the hospital. 6 days later, the cops found the killer, who had previously murdered 2 other women. He went to prison for life, and he died there in 2016. A few years after the murder, psychologists inspired by the story reported on in the New York Times started running experiments in the lab. Usually, these experiments went like they would have a person witness some emergency situation either by themselves or in a small group. And for the most part, these studies showed that people were more likely to act when they were alone, bolstering this idea of a real bystander effect. But for the past 15 years, psychologists have teased apart this story and confirmed that any bystander effect had nothing to do with the Kitty Genovese case. And studies that look at real-life emergencies, like one paper from 2019 that examined the security camera footage of 200 incidents from 3 different countries, tend to find that people are actually very likely to act in an emergency when they're surrounded by a group of people. So if there is a bystander effect, then it can only really be seen in controlled laboratory conditions. The real world is much, much messier, where people have very different motivations and fears and abilities compared to a lab. I suspect that these days, anyone who knows the name Kitty Genovese also knows the controversial history of how that case was used by psychologists, And they also know that it was much more complicated than originally presented in Intro to Psychology textbooks in the 1980s. But the allure of a bystander effect persists, possibly because it speaks to our fears about what is at the heart of human nature, the inherent lack of goodness or a lack of bravery or heroism that lurks in our souls. And that brings me to the reason I've been thinking about all this lately. No, not because of Shakira and the Hungry Boars, which would make an excellent pub quiz team name. Just throwing that out there. But because of some other news out of Philadelphia and a content warning here, I'm going to be discussing rape and sexual assault. So last month, I saw a bunch of different news stories about how a woman was allegedly raped on a SEPTA car, subway car in Philadelphia, while the other occupants just watched and then occasionally pulled out their phones to record it for social media. So here we have this perfect combination, really, of the idea of the bystander effect and also the callous effects that social media has on us, where people these days are just so disconnected from reality and from humanity that they care more about Instagram than another person's life or safety. Anybody that was on that train has to look in the mirror and ask why they didn't intervene or why they didn't do something, said a police spokesperson. A psychologist told CNN, some people may have been concerned about retaliation, some people may have been concerned about being harmed themselves, and, bystander effect, some people may have thought that someone else is going to intervene. All three of those, in my view, are unacceptable. So when I first saw this making the rounds on social media with a lot of scolding of those passengers, I was skeptical. I mean, it's my default state, but there were also a few red flags. The experts were citing the bystander effect, which has yet to be proven to be real in the real world. All of the information we had came from the police and not from the victim or the witnesses. And the police were clearly pushing for the public to be angry and upset at the witnesses. I mean that literally. The SEPTA police chief held a press conference in which he said, what we want is everyone to be angry and disgusted and to be resolute about making the system safer. The police even threatened that those witnesses might be held criminally accountable. I'm not saying that it's not on all of us to help create a better society, but I'm pretty sure that most people think that the entire purpose of having a police force is to make us safer. I'm not going to go into whether or not the police think that that's their job or whether or not that actually is their job, but it's a bit odd, or at least it should be odd, that the police response to this isn't, we failed to protect this woman, but that random strangers failed to protect her. You know what they say about lies? They fly halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its pants. So, a week after all of this got a lot of coverage, Delaware County District Attorney Jack Stolzheimer told the media that actually the cops were full of shit. Misinformation, he called it. Let's look at the facts. The assault started around 9 p.m. when the victim boarded the same train as her rapist. The rapist groped the victim for about 40 minutes before escalating to actually raping her shortly before 10 p.m. At that point, a SEPTA employee noticed that something seemed amiss, though he wasn't totally sure what was happening, and he called the police, who boarded the car and arrested the rapist about 6 minutes after the rape began. When the first officer arrived at the train, he told the Philadelphia Inquirer, as soon as the train cars opened, everyone was pointing, it's over there, it's over there. So for most of the time that this assault was happening, it was on a mostly empty train car while people were boarding and then leaving at various stops and probably not paying much attention to a couple who, for all they knew, were just having an argument. Once the rape started, should the few people still on board have physically intervened? I mean, I would hope so. If it were me being assaulted, I would hope that someone would have noticed and intervened sooner. And that is a conversation that we can have. But we don't know anything about those witnesses. We don't know how strong they were, if they were even capable of physically intervening. And they did intervene by pulling their phones out, something that can be used both as a way to gather evidence and a way to scare the perpetrator away if he knows that he's being filmed. And when a police officer finally showed up, they directed him exactly where he needed to go and then offered him their testimony and their footage to help him make the arrest. Local journalists point out that there are potential bystanders who we know can physically intervene because they are trained to deal with these situations and they are paid to intervene in these situations. Those bystanders are known as the police. But despite SEPTA's claim that their officers patrol the trains during all operational hours, there was an entire hour where not a single police officer walked through that train car. No police officers were watching the CCTV that captured the incident in full. No police officers were paying attention to what was happening on a line that is known to be dangerous, to the point that SEPTA recently shut down one of the stations on that line so employees could clean up the needles and human feces that had made an elevator completely inoperable. A line so dangerous that SEPTA's unionized employees are threatening to strike until something is done to make it safer for them. Not even to mention the other passengers traveling. The employees don't feel safe. And what they want isn't for more members of the general public to put on their superhero capes and stop crimes. What those employees want are broad changes to SEPTA to improve the overall safety of these stations and those trains, and they want the police to do their jobs. I suspect that even though the Kitty Genevieve's bystander effect has long been debunked, we'll continue to see these cases pop up that speak to our inherent belief that with modernization, whether that be urbanization, public transportation, social media, with all of these modern things comes a distancing of our own humanity. It's not true. I mean, social media is deleterious and was deleterious in this situation, but not because it made witnesses of a crime less likely to interfere, only because it spread misinformation that made people more angry at those witnesses than they were at the rapist or than they were at the police who failed to stop the rapist.